Have you ever wondered what it truly costs to get everything you've ever dreamed of? Not in dollars and cents, but in pieces of yourself. In the whispers that follow you out of a room, in the friendships that turn to ice, in the lonely quiet of a mansion filled with beautiful things but empty of belonging. It's a question that lies at the heart of one of the 20th century's most breathtaking and heartbreaking stories. This isn't just a tale of riches or of a famous name. It's the story of a young girl who clawed her way out of unimaginable poverty, a girl who wielded her beauty like a weapon and a key, unlocking a door into a world that was never meant for her, a world of unimaginable power, privilege, and legacy, the world of the Rockefellers. Her name was Barbara, but the world would come to know her as Bobo. She was the immigrant girl who became a modern-day Cinderella, marrying one of America's most eligible bachelors. And then she became the woman who brought that fairy tale crashing down in the most spectacular public and expensive divorce the United States had ever seen. She won a fortune that made headlines around the globe, but in doing so, she became a pariah, a ghost, haunting the gilded halls she had fought so hard to conquer. This is the story of the price of a dream. This is the incredible forgotten story of Barbara Bobo Rockefeller. To understand Bobo's ferocious ambition, you first have to understand the world she was born from. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and marble foyers of Fifth Avenue. Eva Paul was born in 1916 in a small village in Lithuania, a land that had been forged in struggle and hardship. Like millions of others in the great European migration, her family looked to America as a beacon of hope, a place to escape the poverty and uncertainty of the old world. Their port of entry wasn't the glittering skyline of Manhattan, but the smoky, muscular, and often brutal heart of industrial America, Chicago. Specifically, they settled in the area known as the Back of the Yards, the sprawling, pungent neighborhood that serviced the Union Stockyards, the largest meatpacking district on the planet. Upton Sinclair had famously called it the jungle for a reason. It was a place of relentless noise, of the smell of livestock and slaughter, of grinding, back-breaking labor that fueled the nation's appetite. This was the America that greeted Eva. Her family wasn't just poor, they were at the very bottom of the social ladder. Her father took on one of the most somber jobs imaginable. He was a gravedigger. Think about that for a moment. While the Rockefellers were shaping the world from their boardrooms, Eva's father was literally digging the earth for those who had finished their journey. This stark contrast wasn't just a metaphor, it was the reality of her childhood. It instilled in her a profound visceral understanding of what it meant to have nothing, and an iron-willed determination to never return to it. She learned from a very young age that in this new world, survival, let alone success, was a fight, and in that fight, she quickly identified her most powerful asset. As Javut blossomed into a young woman, it became clear she possessed a striking, almost ethereal beauty. In a world of soot and struggle, she was luminous. It wasn't just vanity, it was a realization of power. Her face, her figure, these were her currency. They were her ticket out of the back of the yards. She began to use that currency with shrewd intelligence. She started modeling, and her ambition first took a public stage when she entered and won a local beauty pageant, being crowned Miss Lithuania of Chicago. It was a small victory, but it was a crucial one. It gave her a taste of recognition, of being seen for her beauty rather than her poverty. It affirmed her belief that her looks could open doors, but Chicago was too small for her dreams. The ultimate prize, the grand stage of reinvention, was New York City. And so, leaving Eva Paul and her past behind, she moved to the metropolis and became someone entirely new, Eva Paul. As Eva Paul, She entered the competitive world of acting and modeling in New York. She was beautiful, yes, but so were thousands of other young women who flocked to the city with the same dream. She landed a few bit parts, her face appearing fleetingly in films, her figure gracing advertisements. She was a showgirl in the famed Ziegfeld Follies, a position that placed her among the most beautiful women in the country, but one that also carried a certain social stigma. She was on the periphery of glamour, close enough to touch it, but never quite able to grasp the stardom she craved. But this period was not a failure. It was her education. She learned how to navigate social situations, how to carry herself with poise and confidence, how to converse with men of wealth and influence. She was polishing the rough edges of her Chicago upbringing, crafting a persona of European sophistication and charm. She was no longer just the gravedigger's daughter. She was Eva Paul, an enigmatic beauty with a mysterious past. She was preparing, consciously or not, for the role of a lifetime. And in 1948, her leading man finally walked onto the set. His name was Winthrop Rockefeller. To say Winthrop Rockefeller was a catch is a profound understatement. He was the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, and arguably the wealthiest man in modern history. The name Rockefeller wasn't just a name, it was a national institution. It meant unimaginable wealth, political power, and a social standing that was almost royal. But Winthrop was different. He was often considered the black sheep of his generation of Rockefellers. Unlike his more serious business-minded brothers, Nelson, Lawrence, John D. III, and David, Winthrop was a bon vivant, a charming, hard-drinking playboy with a rebellious streak. He had struggled at Yale, worked as a roughneck in the Texas oil fields to prove himself, and served with distinction in World War II, earning a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. He was restless, constantly searching for something beyond the suffocating expectations that came with his name. He had a string of high-profile affairs, but had remained stubbornly single into his mid-30s. He was, in essence, a man looking for an escape, and he found it in the captivating Eva Paul. They met at a party. The exact details are lost to the mists of society gossip, but the impact was immediate. Winthrop was utterly smitten. Here was a woman who was not from his world. She wasn't a carefully vetted debutante from a fellow blue-blooded family. She was vibrant, worldly, and possessed a confidence that bordered on audacious. For a man tired of the stuffy constraints of his own class, Bobo was a breath of fresh, intoxicating air. He was drawn to her beauty, yes, but also to her grit, to the unspoken story of survival he could sense behind her glamorous facade. For Bobo, Winthrop was the culmination of everything she had ever worked for. He wasn't just rich. He was a Rockefeller. Marrying him wasn't just marrying a man. It was ascending to the highest echelon of American society. It was the ultimate validation, the final definitive escape from the stockyards of Chicago. The courtship was a whirlwind. Winthrop pursued her relentlessly, showering her with affection and gifts. The Rockefeller family was, to put it mildly, aghast. They saw Bobo as a commoner, an adventuress, a showgirl, completely unsuited for a place in their esteemed dynasty. They did everything they could to dissuade Winthrop, but their opposition only seemed to strengthen his resolve. He was a man in love, and for perhaps the first time he was defying his family's wishes in the most public way possible. On Valentine's Day, 1948, they were married. The ceremony itself was surprisingly modest, a small private affair held at a home in Florida, far from the prying eyes of the New York press. The Rockefeller family likely insisted on this, hoping to minimize the spectacle, to treat this union not as a celebration, but as a delicate situation to be managed. But their attempts at discretion were futile. You simply couldn't have a Rockefeller marry a former showgirl in secret. The moment the news broke, it became a global sensation. It was a story too perfect for the papers to resist. The press breathlessly reported on every detail they could find or invent. The immigrant girl from the wrong side of the tracks, who had once danced for a living, was now wedding the scion of America's most powerful, almost puritanically proper family. It was a fairy tale for the modern age, a potent symbol of the American dream in a post-war world hungry for just such stories. For millions of ordinary people, Bobo's ascent was proof that anything was possible in America. But in the drawing rooms of the Upper East Side, the story was read quite differently. They saw a predator and her prey, a carefully laid trap, sprung on a rebellious heir. But Bobo didn't care about the whispers. As she stood there, no longer Eva Paul, she had finally shed the last remnants of Javuti Paulicuti, the gravedigger's daughter. She was now Mrs. Winthrop Rockefeller. In the eyes of the world, and more importantly, in her own eyes, she had arrived. The initial years of their marriage were a dizzying ascent into a stratosphere of wealth that few people can even conceive of. She was thrust into a world of incomprehensible luxury, and unlike many who might have been intimidated, Bobo took to it like she was born for it. Their primary residence was a magnificent triplex apartment at 810 Fifth Avenue, a palatial home in the sky with sweeping panoramic views of Central Park. This wasn't just a fancy apartment, it was a kingdom. A full-time staff of servants catered to her every whim, from drawing her bath to arranging flowers in every room. Her days were a blur of appointments with personal shoppers from Bergdorf Goodman, fittings with couturiers who would fly in from Paris, and consultations with jewelers from Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels. She had an unlimited budget, and she used it to craft a new identity, draping herself in the finest fabrics and jewels money could buy. She was no longer just wearing clothes, she was wearing armor, a glittering statement of her new status. She quickly became one of New York's most talked-about hostesses. The parties she threw were legendary, filled with an eclectic and glamorous mix of people that often made the old guard uncomfortable. She would mingle Wall Street titans with Broadway actors, European aristocrats with modern artists. She had a natural charisma, a vibrancy that was a stark contrast to the stiff formality of traditional Rockefeller gatherings. She had, by all external measures, won the game of life. She had the name, the home, the jewels, the power. She was the master of her universe. Just over a year after their wedding, she gave birth to their only child, a son named Winthrop Paul Rockefeller, affectionately known as Win Paul. In a dynasty like the Rockefellers, the birth of a male heir is a momentous event. It secures the continuation of the line, the passing down of the name and the fortune. For the Rockefeller family, the baby was a bridge, a new blood connection that they hoped might stabilize their wayward son's unconventional marriage. For Bobo, the birth of her son was the ultimate validation. He was her anchor, her flesh and blood proof that she wasn't just a temporary guest in this world of privilege. She was the mother of a Rockefeller. This should have cemented her place in the family, providing the dynasty with another heir, and for a time it seemed to. But children, as they often do, don't just fill cracks. They can also expose them to the light. Even as Bobo was mastering the art of being a society hostess and a new mother, the fundamental fractures in her union with Winthrop were beginning to deepen. The very things that had drawn them together, their vastly different backgrounds, now began to tear them apart. Their perspectives on life, shaped by such opposing experiences, were simply irreconcilable. For Winthrop, wealth was a given, an immense responsibility, and sometimes a heavy burden. For Bobo, who had known profound poverty, wealth was a triumph, a joy, a security blanket to be clutched tightly and displayed proudly. He saw her love for lavish parties and couture as frivolous. She saw his desire for a quiet life of philanthropy and farming in Arkansas as a rejection of everything she had fought to achieve. The gravedigger's daughter had no desire to go back to the dirt, no matter how idyllic the mountain. Their life became a quiet tug of war of unspoken resentments. A.M. Bobo reveled in the New York social scene. She had fought her entire life to get there, and she intended to enjoy it. She loved the galas, the fashion, the power lunches, the constant whirl of activity. This was her victory lap. Winthrop, however, found it all increasingly hollow. He had grown up in that world, and he was desperate to escape it. He craved purpose, a project of his own where he could build something meaningful, away from the shadow of his family name. His eyes turned to a rugged, underdeveloped plot of land he owned on Petit Jean Mountain in Arkansas. It was the antithesis of their life in New York. He envisioned building a model farm, Winthrop Farms, a place where he could experiment with progressive agricultural techniques and contribute to the state's development. It was his passion project, his chance to create his own legacy. But for Bobo, Arkansas was in exile. It was a dusty provincial backwater, 1,000 miles away from the glamour and excitement of Manhattan. She had not climbed to the pinnacle of society only to be relegated to a farm. Their desires were now in direct opposition. He wanted to leave New York. She wanted to conquer it. The arguments grew more frequent, the silences longer. He spent more and more time in Arkansas building his new life, while she remained the queen of their New York apartment, a queen whose king was increasingly absent. Their marriage, which had begun with such passionate intensity, quickly devolved into a lonely bi-coastal arrangement. They were living separate lives, bound only by a name and a son. The fairy tale was over. The war was about to begin. By 1950, just over a year into the marriage, they were effectively separated. What followed was not a quiet, dignified parting of ways, as was the Rockefeller custom. Instead, it became a 4-year, no-holds-barred legal battle that played out on the front pages of tabloid newspapers across the country. It was the society scandal of the decade. This was Bobo's final and most important battle. She knew that simply walking away would leave her with little. She had no real prenuptial agreement to protect her. She was fighting not just for money, but for her future, for the security she had sought her entire life. She hired one of the most famously aggressive divorce lawyers in the country and prepared for war. The proceedings were ugly. The Rockefeller family, desperate to avoid public embarrassment, tried to keep the details under wraps, but Bobo's side was not afraid to leak sordid details to the press. Accusations flew. There were claims of Winthrop's excessive drinking and philandering. In turn, his side painted Bobo as a cold, calculating, and materialistic woman who had never truly loved him, only his name and his money. The private life of the Rockefellers was dissected in public, a spectacle that both horrified and fascinated the American people. Every revelation was another blow to the carefully constructed image of Rockefeller dignity and discretion. Bobo's central demand was for a financial settlement that would ensure she and her son could maintain the lifestyle to which they had become accustomed. It was an audacious demand, one that the Rockefeller lawyers initially balked at. But Bobo held a powerful card, the threat of a public trial that would air even more of the family's dirty laundry. The Rockefellers, particularly the family patriarch John D. Rockefeller Jr., prized privacy above all else. The ongoing public relations nightmare was intolerable. Finally, in 1954, they capitulated. The settlement was, for its time, mind-boggling, Bobo received a total of $5.5 million. This included $2 million in cash and a trust fund for their son, Winthrop Paul, valued at $3.5 million, which she would control. To put that in perspective, $5.5 million in 1954 is the equivalent of over $60 million today. It was, at the time, the largest divorce settlement in American history. Headlines around the world blared the news. Barbara Bobo Rockefeller, the immigrant girl, had taken on the most powerful family in America and won. She was now, in her own right, an exceptionally wealthy woman. She had secured her future and that of her son beyond any doubt. She had achieved the ultimate financial victory. But as the ink dried on the settlement papers, she was about to discover the terrible unspoken price of that victory. Bobo had won the money, but she had lost the world it was meant to buy. The New York high society that she had so desperately wanted to belong to now turned its back on her completely. In their eyes, her sin was not the divorce itself. Such things happened, even in the best families. Her unforgivable crime was how she had handled it. The old money elite of New York, families like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and of course the Rockefellers, operated on a strict, unspoken code of conduct. The cardinal rule was discretion. Family problems were to be handled quietly, privately, behind closed doors. You did not, under any circumstances, air your dirty laundry in public. Bobo had not only aired it, she had hung it from the highest flagpole in Times Square for the entire world to see. She was immediately branded with the most damning label a woman in her position could receive. She was a gold digger. The narrative was simple and cruel. She was seen as a vulgar opportunist who had seduced a naive Rockefeller, and then, when the marriage failed, had blackmailed the family for an outrageous sum of money. The size of the settlement, her greatest triumph, became the primary evidence against her. It was seen not as a fair settlement, but as the spoils of a heist. The social shunning was swift and brutal. The invitations to the most exclusive parties and charity balls stopped coming. When she entered a restaurant, conversations would fall to a hush, followed by hostile whispers. Women who had once called her a friend would now look right through her, offering a cut direct, the ultimate social snub. The doors that had magically opened for her as Mrs. Rockefeller were now slammed shut and bolted. She had the money to buy anything she wanted, a lavish apartment, designer clothes, fine art, but she could not buy back her reputation or her place in society. She was an outcast, a pariah living in a gilded cage of her own making. The irony was devastating. She had spent her entire life fighting to get inside the palace walls, only to find herself exiled to a lonely tower once she got there. One of the most poignant, rarely discussed elements of her story is the profound psychological toll this isolation must have taken. Imagine dedicating your entire existence to achieving a single goal, sacrificing your identity, your past, and enduring a public spectacle to get there, only to discover that the prize was hollow. She was surrounded by wealth but consumed by a new kind of poverty, a poverty of acceptance. She tried to rebuild her life. She later married a second time to a physician named Charles W. Kane, Jr., but that marriage also ended in divorce. She remained in New York, a famous but lonely figure. In the ensuing decades, she gradually faded from the public eye, choosing to live a quiet, intensely private life. The once glamorous Bobo, who dominated headlines, became a recluse. It was as if the woman who had fought so hard to be seen now wanted nothing more than to be invisible. Winthrop Rockefeller, meanwhile, went on to have a distinguished career in Arkansas. He remarried and became a popular two-term governor of the state, lauded for his progressive stances on civil rights and his philanthropic work. He had found his purpose far from the woman who had once been the center of his world. Their son, Winthrop Paul Rockefeller, followed in his father's footsteps, serving as lieutenant governor of Arkansas until his untimely death in 2006. Barbara Bobo Rockefeller passed away in 2008 at the age of 91. Her death barely made the news. To a new generation, her name and her incredible story were largely forgotten. But her legacy is a powerful and unsettling one. On the surface, her life is the ultimate American dream. A penniless immigrant girl who, through sheer force of will, marries into one of the wealthiest families in the world and secures a fortune. It's a story of triumph against impossible odds. But beneath that glittering surface lies a much darker, more complicated cautionary tale, a story about the nature of class in America, a system that can be far more rigid and unforgiving than we like to believe. Bobo was allowed to enter the world of old money, but she was never truly accepted as one of them. She was always the outsider, the showgirl, the gravedigger's daughter. And when she broke their rules, they cast her out without a second thought, proving that while money can buy you a seat at the table, it can't buy you a place in the family. Her story forces us to ask difficult questions. Was she a victim or a predator? A shrewd survivor or a ruthless opportunist? Perhaps the truth is that she was all of those things. She was a complex, flawed, and deeply human woman who did what she thought she had to do to survive and to thrive in a world that had dealt her a difficult hand. She played the game as best she could using the tools she had, and in the end, she both won and lost in spectacular fashion. The story of Bobo Rockefeller is a haunting reminder that the brightest fairy tales can have the darkest endings. It's a lesson that true wealth is not always measured in dollars, and that the highest price we can pay is not for what we gain, but for what we lose of ourselves along the way. She got the money, she got the fame, but she never quite got the belonging she so desperately seemed to crave, and that, perhaps, is the most profound tragedy of all.